Before we begin, a warning. This episode contains disturbing details involving the murder of a young child and other graphic violence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Medicine Hat, Alberta, a quiet prairie city where families left their doors unlocked and kids biked through empty streets after dinner, a place that wasn't supposed to make national headlines. But in April 2006, something unspeakable happened behind one of those doors. A father and mother stabbed to death in their basement, their young son murdered in his bed upstairs, and their 12-year-old daughter gone. At first, it looked like an abduction. Police feared she'd been taken by whoever had slaughtered her family. But as investigators followed the evidence, the story twisted into something far darker. Because Jasmine Richardson hadn't been kidnapped. She was part of it. What began as an online romance between a 12-year-old girl and a 23-year-old man would spiral into one of the most shocking family murders in Canadian history. This is Northern Dark, true Canadian crime. And tonight, we're telling the story of the Richardson Family Murders. It began on Sunday, April 23rd. 8-year-old Tyler Richardson was supposed to meet a friend for a playdate. When he didn't show up, his friend's parents grew uneasy. They walked to the Richardson home just across the street. They knocked. No answer. The house sat quiet, curtains drawn. After hours passed without word, the neighbors called police. Officers entered through the front door. Inside, they stepped into a nightmare. In the basement, Jean-Marc Richardson, just 42, lay stabbed more than 20 times. Nearby, his wife Deborah, 48, was found, also stabbed repeatedly. She had fought back. The defensive wounds on her hands told that story. Upstairs, the horror continued. In his bedroom, 8-year-old Tyler was found in his pajamas, his throat slit, his bedsheets soaked with blood. The home was transformed into a crime scene, but something didn't add up. One family member was unaccounted for, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson. At first, police feared she had been taken. An Amber Alert went out across Alberta. Helicopters and patrol cars searched. But when investigators looked closer inside the house, the pieces began to shift. Nothing had been stolen, no forced entry. And small details in the crime scene, details not made public at the time, pointed toward a possibility few wanted to believe. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was something far more disturbing. The Richardson family lived in a modest neighborhood in Medicine Hat, Alberta, the kind of place where life moved at a calm, steady rhythm. Jean-Marc worked long hours as an electrician, proud of the home he had built for his family. Deborah stayed focused on her children, the kind of mother who made sure every school project was finished and every backpack was ready for the next day. Their daughter, Jasmine, was quiet at first, smart, artistic, and curious. But as she moved into adolescence, something began to shift. Like many preteens, she was trying to figure out who she was. She started experimenting with fashion, music, and online communities that her parents didn't quite understand. She found herself drawn to darker imagery, the kind of art and music that expressed rebellion and intensity. Late at night, she would scroll through websites that celebrated individuality and the idea of being different. For a 12-year-old searching for identity, that world felt thrilling, even empowering. Through one of those communities, Jasmine met a young man named Jeremy Steinke. He was 23, much older, and living a very different kind of life. Jeremy had struggled to find his place in the world. He had a rough history at school, often bullied, and spent most of his time in alternative circles where he felt accepted. He wore dark clothing, listened to heavy music, and liked to stand out. He talked about fantasy and freedom, about living outside of ordinary rules. To Jasmine, he seemed mysterious and exciting, someone who didn't care what people thought. For Jeremy, the attention of someone younger made him feel powerful and wanted. The connection between them grew quickly, built on messages, music, and late-night conversations about how unfair the world could be. At home, Jean-Marc and Deborah noticed the changes. Their daughter was more withdrawn, defensive, and private. When they eventually discovered she was communicating with an adult, they were alarmed. They tried to step in, limiting her internet use, encouraging her to focus on school, and hoping that normal life would pull her back. But instead, the distance seemed to strengthen the bond. The secrecy added fuel to the relationship. Online, away from rules and supervision, Jasmine and Jeremy began to see themselves as two people standing against everyone else. They shared messages about freedom and defiance, comparing themselves to tragic couples in stories where love was forbidden. To them, it wasn't just a relationship. It became a cause, a story they were living out in real time. That sense of drama blurred the line between fantasy and reality. Over the weeks that followed, the tone of their conversations shifted. What began as romantic daydreaming slowly turned darker. They talked about how impossible it felt to live apart and how the obstacles in their way, parents, rules, responsibility, were keeping them from being together. Each message built on the last, reinforcing their belief that they were destined for something extraordinary. But behind that intensity was something unstable, a fantasy growing stronger than reason. At school, friends noticed small changes. Jasmine doodled dark imagery in her notebook, shared songs and quotes that sounded ominous, and seemed detached from her old life. Teachers saw a quiet student, maybe a little distracted, but nothing alarming enough to predict what was coming. In truth, the situation had already slipped beyond what anyone around her could see. The online connection, the secrecy, and the fantasy of rebellion had combined into something dangerous. Not because of a single conversation, but because of how completely it had taken hold of their identities. Jasmine believed she had found love. Jeremy believed he had found someone who finally understood him. Neither realized how destructive that belief would become. On the night of April 22nd, Jasmine quietly left a basement window unlatched. It was the signal Jeremy needed. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, he made his way toward the Richardson home. Earlier that evening, according to trial testimony, both had been in contact, exchanging messages, reaffirming their plan. Jeremy had been drinking heavily and taking drugs. Despite that, he appeared determined, later telling friends that nothing would stop him. When he entered the basement, Jean-Marc heard the noise and went down to investigate. The two met in the dark. Neighbors would later recall hearing a single thud around midnight, followed by silence. Inside, a violent struggle unfolded. Jean-Marc managed to land several blows, hard enough to leave Jeremy with a black eye seen by witnesses the next day. What happened next was fast and chaotic. The father fought until the end. Deborah came running down the stairs when she heard the commotion. Evidence from the scene later showed she had tried to defend herself and her husband. She fought desperately before collapsing near him. With both parents gone, the house fell silent. Upstairs, the light from a television still flickered across the hallway. 8-year-old Tyler was awake, frightened and confused. According to testimony shared during the trials, he pleaded softly, not fully understanding what was happening. By the time the night ended, 3 members of the Richardson family were dead. The small, tidy home on a quiet suburban street would become the center of one of the most disturbing investigations in Canadian history. In the early morning hours, Jasmine and Jeremy fled. They were seen later that day by several people who had no idea what had happened. One friend testified that Jeremy showed up with a black eye, saying he'd been in a fight but laughing as if it didn't matter. Another recalled the pair acting carefree, even affectionate, at a friend's house, talking about leaving town together. When word spread the next day that 3 bodies had been found in Medicine Hat, those same witnesses realized who had been with them the entire time. They contacted police immediately. From that point, the manhunt began. Detectives pieced together the online messages, the open window, and the physical evidence left at the scene. Within 24 hours, officers traced the pair to Saskatchewan, the end of their short-lived escape. By the morning of April 23rd, the quiet neighborhood in Medicine Hat was swarming with police. Yellow tape wrapped around the Richardson home. Detectives moved carefully through every room, documenting evidence. The Amber Alert for 12-year-old Jasmine was still active. At first, investigators feared she had been kidnapped, taken by whoever had killed her family. But as the day went on, a different picture began to emerge. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, nothing stolen. It didn't look like a robbery or a random attack. It looked personal. Officers began examining Jasmine's bedroom. On her walls were drawings, dark, symbolic sketches that hinted at anger and rebellion. Inside her school notebooks, they found messages exchanged with friends, notes that spoke of frustration, fantasy, and escape. In one of her bags, investigators found printed emails between Jasmine and her boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke. The tone was emotional, dramatic, two people describing themselves as outcasts, united against the world. That discovery shifted the investigation in an instant. Jasmine was no longer viewed as a victim. She was now a suspect. The shift intensified when detectives began questioning friends of Jeremy. One after another, they came forward. They told police that Jeremy had spoken often about wanting to get rid of Jasmine's parents, that he described them as the barrier keeping them apart. A few friends said they dismissed it as bravado, the kind of dark talk that floated around their circle until the murders happened. Afterward, Jeremy bragged openly, saying what he'd done and what Jasmine had done. It was enough to confirm what investigators already suspected. This wasn't an abduction at all. It was a partnership in murder. Within 24 hours of the discovery, the investigation reached its breakthrough. Police traced phone records, online messages, and sightings from witnesses who reported seeing a pair matching their description traveling west. By that evening, the trail led to a small town just across the Saskatchewan border. Leader, a quiet community surrounded by open fields. Local RCMP officers were called in to assist. They found a truck parked behind a small house. Inside the cab, curled up together under a blanket, were Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson. The arrests were made without resistance. Witnesses at the scene described the moment as strangely calm, Jeremy smirking as if unfazed, Jasmine sitting silently beside him. In that moment, the missing 12-year-old who had been the focus of an Amber Alert was no longer seen as a kidnapped child. She was now accused of conspiring in the murders of her own family. In the days that followed, the case consumed headlines across Canada. The idea of a 12-year-old charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder was almost unthinkable. The trial that followed would reveal just how far the pair had gone and how deeply they believed in their twisted bond. In 2007, Jasmine Richardson went to trial in a packed courtroom in Medicine Hat. She was only 13, far too young to be tried as an adult. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens moving silently as the Crown outlined a case that had already shaken the country. Under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, the maximum penalty she faced was 10 years, a sentence designed for rehabilitation, not lifelong punishment. Prosecutors argued that Jasmine had not only helped plan the murders, but had personally carried out her brother's killing. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, journal entries, and drawings revealed violent fantasies that mirrored what happened inside the Richardson home. Classmates testified that Jasmine spoke of her parents as obstacles to her freedom, words that took on new meaning after the crime. Psychiatrists testified too. They described her as intelligent but emotionally immature, a child swept up in the influence of an older, controlling man. Still, the jury had to weigh intent against age. After days of testimony and long hours of deliberation, they reached their verdict. Jasmine Richardson was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. She became the youngest person in Canadian history to receive that conviction. She was sentenced to 10 years, 4 years in a secure facility, followed by 4 under psychiatric supervision, and the remainder under community monitoring. The sentence immediately divided public opinion. Some Canadians believed the system was right, that she was a child who could still be rehabilitated. Others felt it was a failure of justice, that 10 years was far too short for the loss of 3 lives. Meanwhile, Jeremy Steinke's trial began in 2008. He was 25 and faced no such limits. The courtroom was tense from the start. The Crown portrayed him as the ringleader, an adult who manipulated a child into murder. Jurors were shown his online messages, where he fantasized about eliminating the Richardsons and living freely with Jasmine. Witnesses recounted his chilling comments after the killings, how he laughed about what happened, bragged about the plan, and told people exactly how the night unfolded. Then came the physical evidence, photos, forensic reports, and emotional testimony that moved jurors to tears. Even seasoned reporters wrote that it was one of the most disturbing trials they had ever covered. The jury found him guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was automatic: life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Inside the penitentiary, Jeremy would later change his name to Jackson May, a symbolic attempt, some said, to escape the identity the world had given him. As the years passed, Jasmine's progress was closely monitored by the courts. Judges received regular reports from psychologists and social workers detailing her treatment, schooling, and reintegration. The reports painted a picture of steady change. She was described as polite, compliant, and motivated to move forward. By 2011, she was allowed to attend community college courses under supervision. By 2013, she was taking university classes and participating in volunteer work. But even then, she lived under strict curfews and continued therapy sessions multiple times a week. In 2015, a judge reviewed her case and lifted the final restrictions, citing consistent progress and a low risk to reoffend. Officials said she had taken full responsibility for her actions and expressed genuine remorse. Finally, in the spring of 2016, Jasmine Richardson walked free at the age of 22. Her decade-long sentence was complete. Under Canadian law, if she remained crime-free for 5 years, her record would be sealed. The case left Canada deeply divided. A 12-year-old who helped plan the deaths of her own family, a 23-year-old who carried it out, and a legal system forced to ask whether rehabilitation could ever balance such loss. Even today, the debate continues. Some see Jasmine's release as a success of the youth justice system, proof that even the most broken path can lead to reform. Others see it as an open wound, a reminder that justice and healing do not always align. Today, Jasmine lives quietly, her identity protected by law. She has not reoffended, and few know where she is. Jeremy remains behind bars, serving out his life sentence under his new name. Their fates forever split, one re-entering the world, the other locked away. The Richardson Family Murders remain one of the darkest crimes in Canadian history, a chilling reminder of how obsession, manipulation, and fantasy can destroy even the most ordinary home. The Richardson Family Murders will always be remembered as one of Canada's darkest stories, a tragedy that forced the country to confront what justice means for the young, the broken, and the lost. A family gone, a child transformed, and a question that still lingers nearly 2 decades later. Can someone so young ever truly leave behind what they've done? Welcome back to Northern Dark. I'm Mark. We are glad to see you join us for another episode. The murder of the Richardson family is a notorious case because of who helped to murder this family, the Richardsons' own daughter.
I'm Leah, and welcome back, and thank you for joining us once again.
Once again, another difficult case to research for our episode.
You know, I'm not going to lie, that one was tough to get through. As a parent, you never think that your child would betray you like this.
I felt the same thing while reading the articles of this case. There are cases where you can almost keep a layer of distance, but this one didn't let me do that. How could a daughter betray their family like this, and almost seem unfazed by it when seen in public after the murders?
The details of a 12-year-old being part of it, that just doesn't sit right in your brain. You picture a kid that age, and it doesn't line up with what we just described.
Yeah. You think about grade 7, middle school, the age where kids are figuring out who they are. And here, instead of sleepovers and field trips, we're talking about a girl involved in planning her family's murder. It's beyond comprehension.
And then Tyler. That's the part that really broke me while listening back. A little boy, upstairs in his room, trusting that the people in the house are going to keep him safe, and it's his own sister who ends it.
It's the moment where people stop trying to rationalize it as manipulation or influence and just feel the weight of what happened. Whatever the reasons, a child's throat was cut. That's why this case doesn't fade.
The basement fight was brutal too. Jean-Marc fought so hard. And the fact jurors cried when they saw the photos, you know how rare that is. Usually, juries hold it together, That tells you how much the violence got to them.
And then there's Jeremy, walking around after like it was nothing, even bragging. That coldness, that almost casual detachment. I think that disturbed people as much as the crime itself.
Let's talk about the online angle, because this case didn't happen in a bubble. Jasmine met him on Vampire Freaks, and that was the same site the Dawson College shooter used. 2 Canadian crimes. The same year, the same website. The media latched onto that right away.
They turned Vampire Freaks into the villain, headlines saying it was corrupting kids, pulling them into darkness, glamorizing violence. Parents panicked, and suddenly goth makeup, heavy music, the whole culture was lumped in as dangerous.
But most of the kids on there weren't killers. They were moody, dramatic teenagers. They were trying on identities. But that nuance never made the papers.
And the important point is that the site didn't create killers, but it did create connections. It put alienated people in the same space. If you were already unstable, already fantasizing, it gave you a stage and sometimes even an audience.
That's exactly what happened with Jasmine and Jeremy. If they hadn't found each other online, maybe this never would have happened. Or maybe it would have played out differently. But Vampire Freaks was the meeting ground, and that matters.
Same with Dawson. Gil used it to post his photos, his persona, his dark thoughts. It wasn't the cause, but it was the amplifier. And in 2006, when these cases hit back to back, it created a moral panic.
It feels almost like a preview of the conversations we're still having now with bigger platforms. What does social media encourage? How much does it reflect what's already there? Where does influence stop and responsibility begin?
And it ties directly into how the justice system handled this case, too. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, what used to be called the Young Offenders Act, there's this belief that young people can be rehabilitated, even after something horrific. That's why Jasmine's sentence was capped at 10 years.
And that's what a lot of people couldn't accept. Because the crime was so violent, so deliberate, there were loud calls for her to be tried as an adult. The argument was simple. If someone can plan something like that, should they still get the protection of a youth sentence?
It's a debate that never really went away. The Youth Criminal Justice Act was built on the idea of redemption, that a child's brain isn't finished developing. But when you see something like this, it challenges that belief. People want accountability that feels equal to the crime, not just potential for reform.
And then you have the other side. Psychologists saying if you throw a 13-year-old into an adult prison, you're guaranteeing they'll never recover. It's that balance Canada's been struggling with for decades, punishment versus rehabilitation.
And the irony is, her file can be sealed, her name legally protected. But in the age of the internet, anonymity doesn't really exist. You can delete court records, but you can't erase the headlines, the screenshots, the forums that keep reposting her story.
Exactly. Once something's online, it's permanent. And in Jasmine's case, even if she's legally forgotten, she'll always be known. That's a kind of life sentence too, just in a different way.
And that's what makes this case so haunting. Beyond the crime itself, it forces you to think about what happens when obsession, vulnerability, and the wrong connections collide.
And I think that's the piece people should sit with. Not just this was a tragedy, but what it says about kids, the internet, and what warning signs we ignore.
Exactly.
If you've been listening, we'd love to know what part of this case struck you the hardest. Was it the family's discovery, the trial, or the way the internet shaped the whole thing? Share your thoughts, and don't forget, follow Northern Dark on YouTube, Apple, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts for more Canadian true crime.
Thank you for joining us. See you next Monday. And until then, take care of each other.